Okay, let me just share my screen. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I will try not to scare you too much. You might recognize or guess the image that I'm starting with here. This is from Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. This is Scrooge meeting the ghost and also the ghosts of ignorance and want. But I'm not going to start there. I'm going to start with a different ghost story, if I can get my slide to move. So this is the opening of probably the other most famous ghost story in the Victorian period. The story had held us round the fire sufficiently breathless, but except the obvious remark that it was gruesome, as on Christmas Eve in an old house a strange tale should essentially be. I remember no comment uttered till somebody happened to note it as the only case he had met with in which such a visitation had fallen on a child. So this is Henry James from 1898. This is a typical Henry James sentence in that it's very long, but also it introduces really quickly so many of the themes of the Victorian ghost story, and a lot of which I'm going to be talking about over the next 20 minutes or so. So you can see immediately the story had held us. It's self-referential. It's referring to itself as a fictional text. It's reminding us of the process of storytelling. Um, it's reminding us how we should respond to what is going to be a ghost story. We should be breathless. We should be listening closely. Um, Importantly for my talk, it's on Christmas Eve in an old house. This is when we should be telling strange tales to each other. And also, just at the end of the sentence, we have this information that the story that has been told, which we never actually find out because this is the beginning of the story, and we're being told about the end of the story as we start a new story. The story was about the possession or the visitation of a spirit upon a child. And there's nothing more creepy than a haunted child. I've just given you the image on the back of the PowerPoint slide here of I think it's the 2009 adaptation, which, to be honest, I have not seen myself, but apparently it's very good. But it does have on the poster these two incredibly creepy children, which is very much in the spirit of the Victorian ghost story. So that's setting the scene a little bit. I'm going to set the scene in a slightly different way. This is just summing up what I've just said. This is a year later, and it's from Fun magazine. I'm not going to read the whole thing out because it's not the best poetry in the world, but once again, it's setting up the whole idea of Christmas ghosts for us. So, with its gay coloured covers, 'tis with us once more, waits riddles and lovers, an annual store. But chiefest amongst all the glories it boasts are ghosts, dreadful ghosts. When bright Christmas faces are smiling in hosts, why on earth should we all want to read about ghosts? So you've got in the 1890s, right at the end of the Victorian period, ghost stories which are published, which begin by talking about ghost stories. And then you have poetry, and this is it's kind of humorous, but also questioning why on earth are we all so fascinated by ghosts? Why is this the thing that we do on Christmas? And particularly Christmas Eve is when ghost stories were very often told in the Victorian period. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about a bit today. I'm just going to skip right down to the end of this poem. So why are we talking about ghosts? And then it says, the host should be the best story. It should be creepy and cruelly and all about ghosts. And then further down, so let us try which can enjoy himself most, each leaving dull care all alone with its ghost. And that is kind of a clue to, I guess, the answer to this question, which is ghost stories are really entertaining. And their amusement, and they're supposed to be fun. It's in Fun magazine, after all, this poem. It's supposed to be fun as much as it's supposed to be scary and disconcerting. And there's something about kind of coming together in a group, a family group or a group of friends or even a group of strangers, and listening to these ghostly stories together when it's cold and dark outside. Hopefully the fire is blazing, and everybody's comfortable, comfortable enough that they can kind of go into these scary places. Oh, I can see there's an echo. I'll keep
Uh, I,
going.
I'm not hearing any echo at all this side,
Oh,
Amanda. I'm
okay.
sorry about that. I do see Amanda, sorry to interrupt. I do see you've joined twice there. It might be that there's two accounts causing an echo. You might just want to have a little look. Thank you.
Just take that opportunity to tap a sip of water. Okay, so ghosts are scary, especially ghostly children, but ghosts are also fun and they bring people together. But why are we so interested in ghosts? That's that poem asks. But here's another possible or part of the explanation is the Victorians, and I think we can say it about ourselves to some extent nowadays, we're just fascinated by the supernatural. They had parlor games, they had seances. You can see this really quite exciting looking seance here from 1871. The image is called Witchcraft in 1871. So people, especially well-off upper middle class and upper class people, would come together and call upon the spirits and see what evidence they could find. And in the most dramatic manifestations, you would get things as in this image, like chairs levitating. Um, You'd also get celebrity psychics. Daniel Douglas Home is one of the most famous ones, and he could levitate himself, allegedly. There are images of him kind of floating up into the air while everybody's watching. At the same time, you would get people who really seriously believed, but who we nowadays might not think of as likely believers. So, one example is the scientist Alfred Russel Wallace. You might know him as the other person who came up with evolution at about the same time as Charles Darwin. It's just Darwin published first. But Alfred Russel Wallace was a kind of very serious, thoughtful scientist, and he I suppose, converted to spiritualism quite late on in life, partly because he was so influenced by what he had seen at these seances. And at the same time as you had the serious believers, you also had the serious seance debunkers, such as the scientist William Benjamin Carpenter. And people like Carpenter would go to these seances in order to try and figure out how it was done. To see the tricks, the pulleys that the mediums were using because they simply didn't believe in the ghosts. So, um, on the one hand, you have people coming together to play with the spirits using Ouija boards, using the medium, the psychic powers of the medium. On the other hand, you have people taking supernatural phenomena very seriously and trying to figure out what on earth is going on in these strange situations. And actually, the Society for Psychical Research, which is interested in looking at looking at the supernatural scientifically, not necessarily debunking it, but just trying to find explanations, supernatural or otherwise, for strange phenomena. This society was founded in 1882, so towards the end of the Victorian period. So one reason the Victorians are talking about ghosts at Christmas time is just because they really like them. They find them really interesting. They like to communicate with them. They like to hear stories about them. And so the fiction that's being published kind of goes along with that interest. It's also going back to a much older storytelling tradition, though. As this, the information on this slide I'm taking from Tara Moore's very good essay, Victorian Christmas Ghosts. And she says British tradition had linked Christmas and ghosts for centuries. So it wasn't just Christmas specifically, but the whole Christmas winter period, starting from Halloween, Samhain, All Souls Night, through November into December. So the darkest, coldest, and also importantly, the bits when it's getting darker and colder. Right where we are now, we are almost as dark and cold as it's going to get. This seems like a time when the spirits are closer, and the time when the boundaries between the living and the dead are maybe less solid than they are at other times of the year. So traditionally, the spirits are very active in the winter. But the stories about spirits are also really active in the winter. And pre-Victorian literature is full of ghosts as well. So the Victorians didn't come up with the ghost story. I've just given you one example from Walter Scott, his poem, Christmas in the Olden Time. He actually says that this is the time at Christmas for telling tales of ghost, goblin, and witch. And this was a little phrase that was often reprinted by the Victorians. So from very early on, they were really into the idea of telling these stories, not just are ghosts real or not, but actually the whole process of telling the haunting. And Tara Moore says, to the Victorians, Christmas time ghost tales felt de rigueur in the same way that spooky stories are an expected part of the American campfire tradition. So again, if you say campfire tales, you know that kind of sitting around on the wooden benches trying to scare each other silly in the woods. But Victorian Christmas stories are sitting around by the blazing fire trying to scare each other silly. It's what you did at Christmas time. So there's a number of reasons as well why the Christmas story becomes important, as in the printed story rather than an orally transmitted tale. There's a number of things which are happening in the Victorian period and the early part of the 19th century, which increase literacy, make it cheaper to print materials, and just generally kind of make storytelling more accessible to more people, or story reading, I should say. So there was the end of what were known as the taxes on knowledge, which included stamp duty, tax on paper. These were removed in the mid-19th century. So publishers could publish more easily, more cheaply, and that kind of filtered down to the buyer. Magazines became more accessible financially, but also with the growth in literacy, they became more accessible to a wider range of people. And at the same time, they were becoming cheaper. So even poorer people could buy magazines to entertain themselves. So you have the Education Act of 1870, which is about providing state schools to places which didn't have schools before. And you can see from the stats on here, between 1851 and 1900, there's a rise in male literacy from 69% to 97%, female literacy from 54% to 96%. So by the end of the 19th century, the vast majority of people can read to some extent. There's also the 19th century is the time of the rise of the middle classes, or late 18th into the 19th century. And the middle classes are the class that they're not leisured, but they have more time than the working classes, and they have commutes, and they have weekends and evenings when they have time to themselves, and also they are undertaking work which is giving them the kind of income that just gives them a bit of disposable cash. And many of them chose to spend that money on magazines, periodicals, books, literature, which again was becoming cheaper. So it was just easier to access stories in the 19th century and as the 19th century went on. But that doesn't really explain the emphasis on ghost stories and why these are the things that really jumped out. We also have the what I've cynically called the commercialization of Christmas, but I've also put a quote here from the Victoria and Albert website. They've got a really nice Christmas display at the moment, and they've got a little web page which talks about it. But the V&A says Victorian advancements in technology, industry, and infrastructure, as well as having an impact on society as a whole, made Christmas an occasion that many more British people could enjoy. So I've cynically said Christmas was commercialized and they could make more things and sell them to more people. But the V&A is also pointing out that actually this made things like Christmas cards, Christmas crackers, Christmas trees more accessible to people. So the whole season, or especially the specific day of Christmas, became more and more of a thing, and it was a time to spend with your family and a time to kind of come together. And one thing that you can do when you come together is tell each other spooky stories. And so the whole tradition of Christmas started to crystallize in the 19th century, and ghost stories were a part of this. Charles Dickens, oh, that's not moved over. There we go. Charles Dickens had an awful lot to do with this, as you can probably guess, because A Christmas Carol is so, so famous. So the interesting thing about Dickens is, and I will admit, A Christmas Carol is not my favorite ghost story. I think it's too sentimental. I like my ghosts properly scary, and vengeful. But A Christmas Carol was so very, very popular because it merged a kind of moral message for Scrooge, who has to learn the true spirit of Christmas, with the ghostliness and the spookiness that readers really enjoyed. And it was a massive hit. Dickens didn't actually make as much money out of it as he wanted to, because he became very fussy, I could say, about the binding and the printing and the production quality of the book. And he actually spent a lot of money getting it into this very nice kind of gilt cover. But he spent a lot of money on the outlay and then didn't get as much back as he wanted, but still it was very successful. And we can tell how successful it is because it has been adapted many, many, many times, obviously, with the ultimate peak adaptation of A Muppet's Christmas Carol. I could not resist putting a little picture just down in the corner there. I think it's interesting, though, to have a look at the note that Charles Dickens puts on the inside of A Christmas Carol. He says, I have endeavoured, so this is in the first edition, I have endeavoured in this ghostly little book to raise the ghost of an idea which shall not put my readers out of humour with themselves, with each other, with the season, or with me. May it haunt their houses pleasantly, and no one wish to lay it. Their faithful friend and servant, C.D. So what's going on that's really interesting here is Dickens is using the ghostliness, my ghostly little book, in a kind of almost a kind of cute way. He's not making his ghosts seem too scary, and this is because he wants to keep with the spirit of the season, the spirit of goodwill, and it should haunt the houses of his readers pleasantly. So actually, although there are plenty of ghostly manifestations in A Christmas Carol, it's not really that typical of many of the ghost stories that the Victorians were reading at Christmas time, because it does have this, not to give it away for anyone who hasn't read it or seen A Muppet's Christmas Carol, it does have a happy ending. Scrooge learns his lesson, and things get better. This does not always happen in Victorian Christmas ghost stories, absolutely not. Dickens was not only good at writing his own Christmas ghost stories, he also was really instrumental in supporting other writers who produce Christmas ghost stories. So in the poem I quoted from the beginning, it mentioned the annuals, the annual time of year, but it had it in quotation marks. And it's actually a kind of playing with the term, because one of the main ways in which these Christmas stories were shared was in Christmas annuals or special Christmas numbers of periodical magazines. And Charles Dickens had his Household Words and his All the Year Round, which were two of the best-selling, most prominent magazines of the time. And he used them to share and promote the work of other up-and-coming or successful writers. I think probably two of the most famous ones nowadays are Wilkie Collins and Elizabeth Gaskell, who you may well have heard of, but also other people who were really well known in the Victorian period and maybe aren't so much now, such as Hesba Stretton, for example. I'm just showing you here, sorry for those of you looking on small screens, but you don't really need to see the details. What you can hopefully see is this is The Haunted House, the extra Christmas number of All the Year Round, conducted by Charles Dickens. And it's got the amount of 2 ordinary numbers in it, which means it's a bumper edition for the Christmas period. In the same way that newspapers now have bumper magazines that come with them, so giving you extra reading material over the Christmas holidays. And in this particular collection, we have the whole kind of premise is there's a haunted house, and some people invite their friends to come and tell the tales of what they experience in the haunted house. And then Dickens gets his literary colleagues to write their own stories. So everybody contributed a different story to the collection. So in this way, Dickens is really important in the development of the Christmas market. The whole Christmas book annual keepsake gift book tradition is not just supernatural stories. It's not just ghost stories. I just wanted to kind of show this just to give you a little bit of context and think a little bit about the way the markets are developing. So earlier in the 19th century, kind of the 1840s and 50s, you get these very ornate, lavish, gilt-covered collector's books, like the Keepsake was probably the most famous one. And these were usually full of quite sentimental poetry, nice little stories, little snippets, and they were very much considered kind of gifts that you could pass on to loved ones. By the time you get to the later 19th century, you have much cheaper, more ephemeral, but still quite nicely decorated, as you can see, Christmas annuals. So this is Beeton's Christmas annual, in which Sherlock Holmes first made his appearance in 1887. So neither of these have anything to do with the supernatural, but it kind of shows how the ghost story is taking part in and a really important part of the Christmas annual tradition. Obviously, it was also a really good way for authors to make some extra money. So on top of the novels and stories that they were printing throughout the year, getting a ghost story in a big name magazine would be really beneficial for your career and your pocket. So this is just an example. One of my absolute all-time favorite authors, Mrs. J.H. Riddle, also known as Charlotte Riddle to modern readers, but she went by her married name. And this is The Disappearance of Mr. Jeremiah Redworth. So whereas some of these Christmas annuals would have lots of different stories by different people, some of them were just a kind of a novella by one really popular, successful author, as in this case. So you can see there's a nice cover page. It comes with really nice illustrations. This is Miss Gower alone in a room at night, having a strange experience. But also you would get on either side loads and loads of adverts. Again, if you're watching on a small screen, you might not see all of the details here, but you are being encouraged to buy work boxes, chatelaines, jewelry boxes, dressing cases, writing desks, scales for weighing letters, that's useful, albums for drawing, poetry, Bible, prayer books, all sorts of stuff, cigarette cases, key boxes, inkstands, smelling bottles in case you faint because you're reading something too scary. So lots and lots of advertising goes around. I'm coming back to the commercialization of Christmas and of these Christmas stories. There's lots of opportunities to get you to buy things at the same time as you're having your scary reading experience. So that's kind of a bit of the background of why these stories became popular. And there's the kind of financial, economic possibilities, but also the Victorian just fascination with the supernatural and with ghosts. One thing about ghost stories, though, if we're thinking about what's actually in them, the content of the ghost stories, is they can be really repetitious because you have to have a set number of things that make it a ghost story, usually a ghost. Although sometimes it's debatable whether it's a ghost. Some of the best ghost stories have open endings and we don't know for sure. I've just put a few on the screen here, some of which are really obvious. If you're going to have a ghost, you need a ghost seer, somebody who's going to interact with or at least think they've seen the ghost. Often that ghost seer has initial disbelief. Often it's a man of science or somebody who's very rational, very studied and intelligent who goes in scoffing at the idea of the ghost, and then they get their comeuppance as the strange things happen to them, and they have to kind of swallow their pride and learn to accept the supernatural. There's a lot of emphasis in the ghost stories on the sins of the past, the sins of the father, things that have gone wrong, or crimes, things that have happened in the past which come back to literally haunt the protagonist or the hero or heroine. Often these are related to money and inheritance. So very, very often in the Victorian period, in the ghost stories, the ghost is coming back to show you where the will is hidden, or to show you where the money is buried, or to show you that the person who's inherited the money is not the right person, and that actually somebody else should have that money. So weirdly, even though these are very stories of the next world and stories of the dead coming back, the focus is very much on the practical financial things which will help the living to get on in their lives and to live comfortable lives. So it sounds quite mercenary, but the ghosts are often very, very interested in money. And I've just put right at the bottom there, resolution, question mark. Lots of these stories end with a moral or a message that we can take away with us. But a lot of these stories are asking us to question what's actually happened. What are we supposed to take away from this? Was there even a ghost in the first place? So even though there's a lot of repetition in many of these ghost stories, to be a true artist when you're writing the ghost story, you need to be able to play within those boundaries and those generic kind of requirements, but also to do something that's going to keep your reader guessing, a reader who's read loads and loads of ghost stories every Christmas, but they still have to think, oh, what's going to happen this time? And it was a real skill, which I think is why you get some really famous novelists, including Charles Dickens, Wilkie Collins, Elizabeth Gaskell. That's why you get them taking part in this. So I'm not going to spend long talking about all of my favorite ghost stories, although I want to, but I'm just going to give you a really quick snapshot of some of the different types of ghost story that we get. And then I'm happy to talk about more during the questions. So one of the most famous ones from the 1850s is Elizabeth Gaskell's The Old Nurse's Story. This is collected a lot in ghost story collections. So we have, this is The Old Nurse's Story, and it's set up as the old nurse telling the story of when she was looking after her current ward's mother. I've put the front cover of the collection here. Once again, it's a Christmas annual from 1852. So it's part of a collection of lots of different stories, most of which are ghost stories. I'm not going to tell you what happens in all these because you might want to go away and read them, but just to give you a taster, we have the old nurse telling her story, so it's harking back to this oral tradition. There's more than one haunted child. There's some ghostly music. There's a ghostly organ player. And you also have the ghosts are actually reenacting the past. So this is something that's really common. You see the ghosts kind of play act what happened to them in the past to reveal the truth. There's lots of family feuding and revenge. There's some sisters who really don't get along in this story. And we have a very neat moral ending. What is done in youth can never be undone in age. So watch what you're doing because mistakes now could come back to bite you later. We also have Sheridan Le Fanu, again, a very, very famous ghost story writer and writer of the Gothic. You might know Carmilla, which is one of the early vampire novels, one of the first female vampires in English literature. Sheridan Le Fanu wrote loads of ghost stories, and he's really smart at it. An old account of some strange disturbances in an old house in Angiers Street from 1853. Again, December, it's another Christmas story. Begins, interestingly, it is not worth telling this story of mine, at least not worth writing. But then he goes ahead and writes it down. And again, it's the ghost story's interest in the telling of ghost stories and its self-awareness that this is a tale of fiction. But of course, one of the things that the fictional ghost story does is to pretend that it's not fiction. This is always a true story that's being told. It's a thing that happened to me or my friend or a friend of a friend. So you have to buy into that belief that this is true events. Just going to, obviously, my talk's called A Strange Christmas Game, so I had to mention this one by Mrs. Riddle, my favourite author. This is a brother and sister who move into a house because their relative, their distant relative, dies mysteriously. And the mystery is what happened to this relative, and there's all sorts of strange noises in the house. Again, there's this self-referential element. At one point, the narrator says, "My dear reader, you doubtless are utterly free from superstitious fancies. You pooh-pooh the existence of ghosts and only wish you could find a haunted house in which to spend the night. It's all very brave and praiseworthy, but wait until you are left in a dreary, desolate old country mansion filled with the most unaccountable sounds." Which is kind of what the ghost story is asking us to do. It's asking us to stop pretending that we're so rational and so kind of intellectually minded, and to embrace the fears and the chills and the possibility of the supernatural. So the ghost story writers are often calling out to us as readers to come and enjoy the fun, to kind of take part in the spookiness. I'm not going to go through the rest of these in the same amount of detail, but I highly recommend Rhoda Broughton's The Truth, the Whole Truth, and Nothing But the Truth. This is an epistolary one, so it's two women writing to each other, and one of them has taken a house with mysteriously low rent. Never, ever, ever take a house with mysteriously low rent. It could be that the plumbing is bad. It could be that the roof's about to fall in. It could be that it has a mysterious supernatural presence. And this one is a particularly malevolent, nasty force. Two more I just really love, which are not so easy to get hold of, but really creepy stories. Mary Elizabeth Braddon's The Shadow in the Corner, where a young girl moves into a house of a scientist who, again, pooh-poohs the whole idea of the supernatural. But she starts to see a mysterious shadow hanging in her corner every morning when she wakes up. And it's all about what happens to her as she tries to get people to believe what she's seeing. Charlotte Riddle's A Terrible Vengeance is a brilliantly crafted story where we realize that there's been a mysterious watery death. And one of the male characters starts to get small, tiny, wet footprints following him wherever he goes, including on his wedding day and on his honeymoon. And the whole mystery, because often, again, ghost stories are full of mystery as much as spookiness. The whole mystery is what's going on with these mysterious footprints that are following him around. And we find out to an extent, but I won't tell you. You can find out for yourself. If you are looking for ghost stories, a lot of these are really cheap and really easy to get hold of, but only if you go to secondhand shops. And I've just shown you my my little collection. These Tales of Mystery and the Supernatural, if you see one in a bookshop, just buy it, because they're cheap and they're great and they're full of actually quite hard to get hold of supernatural tales. I think I'll stop there. Oh, final slide. There you go.
That is perfect. Thank you so much, Helena. That was amazing. I don't think I can stress enough how much this is so perfect for me. I love ghosts, love Christmas. This is just right up my street. We've had a couple of comments in the chat there, but no questions yet. But you were saying those are quite easy to track down, those stories.
Well, they are, but they're not in print. But if you go into secondhand shops, there's usually like loads of them.
Okay.
It's a particular series which have got this kind of blood splatter on the top. I don't know if you can see that.
Yep.
But they're just they just give you access to lots of stuff which isn't in more common collections, basically.
Okay. Got you. So I'll say I have to read these now, obviously.
Secondhand shops. This is the way forward.
Yes.
Yeah.
Definitely. So Bob has said, No Coward's blithe spirit seems to be an homage to Victorian ghost stories, with Margaret Rutherford doing a wonderful send-up of a psychic at a seance in the 1945 adaptation. Coward gives us a ghost or ghosts who is vengeful and creates or continues a family feud. The story has an ironic resolution and is always entertaining rather than scary.
That sounds great. I don't
Yeah.
actually, I've heard of it. I don't think I've actually seen it, but this is this kind of balance between the entertaining and the scariness is really, really important. And also, so many Victorians were making fun of the seances, the supernatural. They were having a laugh with it as much as they were kind of embracing the spooky side.
Yeah. No, I've never seen it either, but I've definitely heard of it, so I'm going to go and try and
Yeah.
track that down as well. I was just going to ask, because you spoke about Turn of the Screw at the start,
Hmm.
and I'm not sure if you've watched or are familiar with at all the adaptations that have been coming out on Netflix, the Mike Flanagan adaptations, like The Haunting of
Oh,
Bly
yes.
Manor.
Yes.
Yes, which is obviously very clearly based on the story of the Turn of the Screw, but a complete sort of reimagining of it and a retelling of it. What's your feelings on like kind of these reimagined works?
I'm not a fan of adaptations which reimagine things, but I did think that that was brilliant. I really enjoyed it. So
It was, wasn't it?
yeah, I think there's definitely something to be said for adapting things to the kind of interests of nowadays. And you know, old Victorian tales of country mansions are not necessarily for everyone. But then if you can pull in themes which are more relevant, it's keeping those authors alive, and hopefully people will go away and read the originals. Um, but when they're done well, they are really, really good. And that was a fantastic adaptation or reimagining.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting as well. They did the Edgar Allan Poe series, which was so many of Poe's works put into one story in one
Yeah.
family. It was very clever, but it's so different from, like you're saying, the source material. So let's have a look here for questions. Well, someone has said, Thank you. This has been so fun and interesting. I just downloaded a collection of ghost stories from Charlotte Riddell, and I can't wait to dive in this holiday season. So there you go.
This was,
Um,
yeah. You probably, as well as the kind of secondhand books, archive.org is really great, and it has the original copies of the first editions. It's so you've got to read it online. It's not the same as curling up in bed with a book, but you can download those original stories. And
okay.
Charlotte Riddell's Weird Stories, I think, is on there. Definitely, some of her collections are on there. A Terrible
Fantastic.
Vengeance is on there, which is the Watery
Oh,
Footprints one.
good. Excellent. Sounds amazing. Okay, so the next question is, how did the presentation of ghosts in festive literature change as we moved out of the Victorian period?
So that's interesting in that I don't actually know much about the Christmas festive element into the 20th century. Um, it kind of it kind of fades away, and I'm not really sure why. The First World War had a lot to do with a change in attitudes towards the supernatural and supernatural entertainment. But I don't really know what that did to Christmas. Um, but you still get really interesting and kind of well-crafted ghost stories in the early 20th century. Thinking about Edith Wharton, for example, and kind of modernist ghost stories. And they are they're kind of more psychological, I guess, less plot driven, and they become often quite darker as well. Some of the Victorian ones are very dark and quite gruesome, but the modernist short ghost stories are really kind of psychologically oppressive in a slightly different way. So and also brilliant. I think they're worth pursuing, even though I'm a Victorianist.
I think it's really interesting how the ghost story for Christmas has sort of had a resurgence in the last, well, in recent years. Certainly my family, that's like been a new tradition for us on Christmas Eve is we all watch the ghost story for Christmas together when it's on BBC
Yeah,
One.
yeah,
So
yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
and I think there is something really nice about that kind of coming together to be a little bit scared, but
Mhm.
never anything too horrific. That's the thing. It's got to be family entertainment, but also scary.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, next question is how do you see the connection between Victorian year-round sensational literature and these Christmas ghost stories?
Well, That's a really good point. One thing I was going to say, which I didn't say, was ghost stories set at Christmas are not always printed at Christmas, and ghost stories read at Christmas time are not always printed at Christmas. So, one of my favorite ones is from a summer edition, a summer number, a special summer number. But people would have then saved it to read at Christmas time. But thinking about the connection with kind of sensation fiction, which is this very kind of over the top, fun, kind of exaggerated literature that you get in the kind of 1860s and 1870s. And also other genre fiction, so detective fiction, and even the start of science fiction. The emphasis on like the mystery, having to solve the mystery, having a case or a thing that has to be achieved. The past coming back to haunt you. It also connects with Gothic fiction, more general Gothic fiction like Dracula. I think all of this genre fiction, including the sensational, is tapping into some very kind of basic fears and anxieties, but also fascinations. And they're doing it in different ways, but they're all, yeah, tapping into those very human desires and worries and concerns.
Super, thank you. Okay, the next question is, were the ghost stories appreciated by literary critics at the time too, or just by the masses?
You get, yeah, yes, but in a slightly sniffy way. So you get these reviews which are like, oh, well, of course it's a collection of ghost stories, but it's actually quite good, I suppose. There's a real there's a real tone to them, which again is the same. Some of the very best sensation novels, the critics would say, oh, well, it is quite well crafted for a sensation novel. But because some of the big literary names, like Charles Dickens, were publishing, I think they did get a bit of respect. And because they were admittedly, these are moments of fun and entertainment, and they're not claiming anything too highbrow. They're not claiming to be too highbrow, so the critics can kind of go along with the fun without coming down from their own high horses.
Yes, got you. Okay, so how do you think Victorians would respond to today's ghost stories and tales? Would it be tame in comparison, or would it shock them?
Oh, I think it depends because, like with the Victorians, there's such a range nowadays. I don't necessarily think so much in terms of written stories, but when I'm teaching the Gothic, I refer to horror films as a way of thinking about horror and terror. And there are these, there are horror films where nothing happens and it's so suspenseful and it's just about the tension. And then there's horror films which are really gory, in your face slasher flicks. Most Victorians would not have approved of the slasher flicks, but they would love the tension, and the terror of some of the really creepy stuff. Paranormal Activity, I think they would love that. So
Classic.
yeah. And I think, some of the Victorian ones are actually quite shocking as well when you see what happens to some of the characters, but more in terms of horrible fates. And there's the very classic, it's an urban legend really, but lots of authors wrote it up, the bride who plays hide and seek, and she climbs into a casket or into a kind of a chest, and it closes, and they look for her and look for her and look for her, and she just dies and no one finds her. And then years later her ghost is wandering around saying, please find my body. It's really
dark.
Yeah. So I think they could handle it.
Yeah. Okay, what do you think is the most underrated spooky ghost story?
It's The Shadow in the Corner by Mary Elizabeth Braddon, because there's something about this young girl who wakes up every morning and says there is something, and it looks like a body hanging from the wardrobe. And the scientist goes in and he says, okay, I will spend the night in your room. And he also sees it, but he's too proud to admit it. He says, oh, it must be something I ate. It must be my digestion, which is very common. And then forces her to go back into the room and spend the night. And the next day she is found hanging from the wardrobe. Again, really dark, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's written in such a creepy way. And you just think, don't go back in that room, don't go back in the room. Oh no, she has.
Yeah, I
which is
am
what you want.
definitely going to read that one. Um, is there a European tradition of ghost stories, or is it only British American?
So there's a lot of German Gothic writing, and I think I'm not an expert at all on German ghost fiction, but there's definitely a kind of element kind of coming over from there. The French were quite, I think there's more Gothic connections, more general Gothic than necessarily ghost stories. But there was at this time, there was so much kind of traveling across the channel, as well as America and Britain and Europe. So they were translating each other and reading each other. So I would say yes without having a definite example to hand.
Okay, thank you. There's lots of people saying thank you. But Philippa said, thank you for a fascinating overview of this issue that is not so talked about these days, which is, I would agree with that. Um, Next question. I just wondered if you think Dickens was perhaps the only one of these writers who felt that promoting social reform was maybe more important in A Christmas Carol than the ghostliness, sorry.
That's a really good question. I'm trying to think because my immediate answer is no. I think other people were interested in using ghosts as a way of thinking about social reform, but I can't think of anybody who does it so kind of blatantly as Dickens. But you have these kind of moral endings, and there's a lot of quite feminist ones which are less overtly about social reform, but where women, especially because a lot of female writers wrote ghost stories, it's kind of exploring women's restrictions within society and the woman being trapped in the domestic space of the haunted house is used as a way of reflecting upon women's position in society. So yeah,
There's just been
just seeing
an
that way.
excellent comment in the chat.
Yes.
It says, no
Oh,
questions, but
spooky.
I just wanted to mention that half the lights in the room I'm in went out while you were speaking. Spooky.
Just be
That is
careful.
very spooky. Okay, next question. Were the morals in the ghost stories focused on the things that were more timely in the Victorian age or just general things?
Um, Well, pretty general, except I think I was kind of talking about the financial benefits of if you're a ghost hunter, if you're a kind of a young man who wants to make his way in life, go and stay in a haunted house and manage to lay the ghost, and you're like, um, you're set. So actually, um, a lot of for the male ghost hunters, a lot of it is being taught how to act in a way that will make you a good member of society, but very specifically of Victorian society and kind of adhering to gendered norms. So I think it's quite a Victorian outlook, but in general, it's be nice to each other. Don't try and cheat each other out of inheritance.
Hmm?
Don't don't date your sister's boyfriend. That's a bad one. So pretty universal, really.
Absolutely. Okay. Have we got any more questions at all? I think that's them all from the chat. I need to ask you what's your favorite film or television adaptation of A Christmas Carol?
Oh, it's the Muppets.
Yes.
There is no other adaptation.
I swear I asked Dan Wall this question a couple of years ago as well to be like, is it good? Come on, it's good, isn't it? And I completely agree. It's the absolute best adaptation out there.
It's a classic for many good reasons.
Yes, exactly. Okay. I think that's probably it then, unless no, I think we're good. Yeah, I think everyone's someone just said Muppets is the
Muppets.
best. Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, there's great comments coming in. But thank you everyone for engaging so well and asking such good questions. That was just absolutely brilliant.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, really enjoyed that. As this recording will be on our YouTube channel in a couple of days.
Just loving the
Loving the
comments.
chat just now. So you can watch again and you can write down the names of all the stories that you want to read. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Helena, for spending the time with us this afternoon. It's so appreciated.
Thank you very much.
And
Merry Christmas,
Merry
everyone.
Christmas, everyone. Have a brilliant Christmas, and we'll see you again next year. Bye.
Bye.